Recognize the Honourable Member Commissiong. Honourable Member, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier we had the Leader of the Opposition coming out with an old canard from the 1980s or 90s. The comments or analysis from John White about the fact that all things with respect to immigration into Bermuda, migration into Bermuda of foreign workers is good. We had a number of persons on this side, including the member from constituency 5 and the member from constituency 32, including myself, who disputed that. Mr. Speaker, during a time when we were preparing the final report of the Joint Select Committee, in one of the earlier versions of that report, I had included this bit of research here from the UK Centre for Research and Analysis of Migration. And with your indulgence, I would like to convey this to the members and the listening public. That analysis found that empirical evidence would suggest that if immigrant workers, with respect to the native wage distribution, are competing with low-skilled local workers, the effects can be negative when it comes to wage compression in particular. Although they found that the effects are more positive overall the further up the so-called distribution one looks as it relates to median to higher skilled workers. Translation, inundating a country with low-skilled, low-paid workers does not help your economy. They are directly competing against your own, mostly non-college educated, low-skilled workers who are having to endure what I call the race to the bottom on wages. And after 25 years since the great doubling that occurred with the globalization, which led to a doubling of the world's workforce, Bermuda has not been immune to these effects. That's why you're hearing calls for higher wages in the US, UK, Bermuda, statutory wages, living wages, in an attempt to combat this trend. So let's not have a one-size-fits-all on the issue of immigration. We had some more nuanced discussion that's required here. Mr. Speaker, Harvard's Richard Freeman, for example, professor there, he wrote a book called The Great Doubling, and he focused on this. He specializes in looking at the global economy and migration trends and the like. And he said that during that time of the 1890s and 80s and 90s, the global workforce doubled from 1.46 to 2.93 billion. Coupled with the whole ethos around globalization, the lowering of borders and barriers, including to migration and immigration, you see the result today, especially from places like Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and the like. Those who've been most impacted by that are, again, low-skilled, non-college educated in these respective countries. Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to segue here to what was going to be the basis of my conversation, my discussion today. During Black History Month, and actually we're on the same topic of immigration to some degree, during Black History Month there was an infamous interview that occurred on ZBM News with Tarai Trott being the host. Mr. Trott has as his guests, the interviewees, Dame Jennifer Smith and Sir John Swan. The topic was Black History Month. Sir John Swan, when asked about Black History Month, basically opined that white Bermudians were not like the whites in the southern part of the U.S., after all. He went on to say that they didn't lynch black Bermudians, for example. He said that. on ZBM News during Black History Month. And if you're talking about an insult to black Bermudans, but particularly the black Bermudans of his generation, I don't think you can do much worse than that. Sir John Swan grew up in that same neighborhood with my family, my mother, the Talbots, that government gate, St. Monica's Mission, Marsh Folly neighborhood. Every now, even today, my mother's hardcore PLP, as you know, but you mention his name, a little twinkle comes to her eye, because they were all little kids at 4, 5, and 6 years old running around that neighborhood. But let's be under no illusion here of who Sir John Swan is. And he keeps reminding us, even at this late age, with his tap dancing for those who form the most reactionary and racist elements in Bermudian society. In 1954, for example, only 3 years before I was born, Sir John Swan would have already been maybe late teens, early 20s. Mr. Hill, I forget his name, was an article in the paper. He's a shipwright. He builds miniature ships. And it was a great article there. And he's tied into that whole Bayless Bay, Eastern Counties matrix of families down there. He related that what drove him initially to want to become a lawyer was an event that took place, I guess, around 1954, only 3 years before I was born, down in the square in St. George's. A neighbor of his, a relatively young man, teenager, has stolen a bike. Do you know the authorities took him down to the square in St. George's, tied him to a stake, and whipped him publicly? I didn't say 1924, Mr. Speaker. I didn't say 1890. 1954. That's the world that Sir John Swan grew up. A world that saw blacks probably earning $1 for every 4 that a similarly qualified white person would have made in this country. A world that saw a House of Assembly that may have, at that time, 1954, had no more than 7, 8, or 9 MPs, even though blacks, even at that period, were the majority in the country. But they didn't lynch us. But it doesn't end there. Let's fast forward now to a few weeks ago. Sir John Swan, again, their go-to person, is on, was it ZBM News again? This time, being interviewed by Tony Waterman, it may have been on her show, actually, in the presence of 2 white foreign journalists, this is important, on the issue of immigration. Now, let me just say this. We can all have a difference here on immigration. Our Minister Keynes, is grappling with that issue now, coming with a set of recommendations, and it's going to lead to a robust debate. There should be. Some will have a more liberal view on immigration. Some will perhaps a more conservative view about how far the country should go. That's all fair. That's what we should have in a democracy as we have. But Sir John Swan, who clearly wants to see a more liberal immigration regime, didn't stop there. He then looked over at and glared at Tony Waterman and said, no, we need to open up immigration. I'm paraphrasing here, right? And I mean rich white people. And the veins almost came out of his neck when he said it. I mean, you're 83 years old, but you're still doing the tap dance for the most reactionary, racist elements in Bermuda society. I started thinking, hey, it's worked for him for 50 or 60 years. Translate that into the ability to tap into sources of patronage and capital throughout his career by saying what racists in Bermuda wanted to hear. Left a legacy where black Bermudians are still a minority presence, both in ownership and in terms of high-level jobs within Bermuda's private sector. That's just Sir John Swan's legacy. It's not the legacy of people like Lloyd James and people we talk about. That's who Sir John Swan is. You want to know why there's only one Patrick Tannick? Look no further than John Swan. You want to know why there's only one Sir John Swan? Look no further than... Mr. Speaker, our premier, thank God, I was away, I heard about it, got up and told them, listen, we'll take investment from wherever it comes. As long as they can pass that Bermuda standard, I might add. Indian, Chinese, African, come on, guys. Bermuda's open for business. But Sir John Swan still tap dancing as if it's 1967. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is a positive here, and let me tell you what it is. ZBM, following that, I mean, the story had legs, right? Let's be honest about it. Went and did a man, men, and woman in the street interview. They interviewed about 7 or 8 or 9 people, a little lengthier than usual, and at least about half of those people were white. I assume most were white residents and or Bermudians. To their credit, each one of them repudiated what Sir John Swan said. Every white person they interviewed, no, I don't think that should be a litmus test, in other words. Well, you know, like our premier said, we should welcome investment from wherever. Repudiated Sir John Swan, and kudos to them. It may show us that there are a growing number of white Bermudians who are starting to get it and are rejecting this whole white identity politics, which has been such a feature of Bermuda in the modern era. And also, did Sir John Swan not hear the words of people like Jonathan Rice and others within Bermuda's international business sector over the last year and a half, 2 years, who have said, we need more racial inclusion? Jonathan Rice, to his credit, I called him and praised him behind the scenes. Him and I having an ongoing conversation around these issues. I know his sister, I know the family going back years. But I'm saying, Jonathan Rice said that white supremacy is a problem. That's correct. And conscious and unconscious bias is a problem. And you know who enabled that problem? John Swan's not the cause of it, don't get me wrong. But he's been a powerful enabler of that status quo throughout Bermuda. But those are the positives. And if we can keep seeing what I call these racial justice warriors in Bermuda's community come out and be prepared to speak publicly and say, no, we're not going to affirm that type of thinking, whether it's coming from a front man like Sir John Swan or from those who he's trying to impress, Bermudas can continue to be better off. And we can put this issue behind us, which is what they claim to want to do. But this is how you do it. So let's today in this House, unequivocally, unreservedly, reject what Sir John Swan says, condemn what Sir John Swan says, and let's make that a bipartisan effort on our part. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.